They came without warning, but I had been waiting for them my entire life. The sky above Geneva broke open at 6:04 in the morning, and I do not mean that poetically. I mean the sky literally cracked, like a dark seam splitting across blue silk, and through that seam came something so large it blocked the sunrise entirely. I was standing at my office window on the 14th floor of the United Nations Interstellar Contact Bureau, holding a cup of coffee that never reached my lips. I just stood there, and I watched, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not fear. Something older than fear, recognition. My name is Yara Osei. I am a xenolinguist. I study the languages of species we have never met, and for the past 11 years, I have been studying one language in particular. The language of the Vreth. I need to tell you what happened. Not the version you have read in news reports, or seen reconstructed in those documentary programs where everything is cleaned up and made to look orderly. I need to tell you the real version, because the real version is the one that matters, and the real version begins not on the morning of March the 4th, but 100 years before it, on a cold night in 1947, when an observatory in New Mexico picked up a repeating signal from a direction no one expected. They did not tell the public. Of course they did not tell the public. What would you say? We found something, and it is enormous, and it has been watching us, and we do not know what it wants. People do not respond well to that kind of announcement. So instead, a small group of scientists and government officials formed a committee, gave it a name so boring no journalist would ever want to write about it, and began the long, quiet work of figuring out who was on the other end of that signal. It took 23 years to decode the first real transmission. I know this because I have read every page of that work, including the handwritten notes of a man named Dr. George Halliwell, who led the decryption team and who wrote in the margin of one particular page, in pencil so faint you almost cannot see it, "I think they are counting us." He was right. They were counting us. They were counting our cities, our vehicles, our vessels on the ocean, our aircraft in the sky, our soldiers on parade grounds, our satellites in orbit. They were counting everything. For 100 years, the Vreth catalogued the entire surface of planet Earth, the way a careful person catalogues a library before they purchase it. I joined the Bureau at the age of 26, when I was still young enough to think that my job was exciting in a romantic sense, the kind of exciting that belongs in stories. I learned very quickly that it was exciting in a different way, the way that standing next to something extremely powerful is exciting, where the excitement is inseparable from a deep, constant awareness that things could go very wrong. My supervisor on my first day was a quiet woman named Dr. Harriet Lowe. She handed me a printed sheet of decoded Vreth text, set a cup of tea on my desk and said, "Read that, then come find me." I read it. Then I sat still for a very long time before I went to find her. The text was an internal Vreth military assessment of Earth's defensive capability. It was thorough, it was detailed, it was in most respects accurate, and it concluded in language I translated myself, with a phrase that I have thought about every single day since. The fruit is ripe. Harvest is recommended within the next solar cycle of the target world. They had written that assessment 41 years before March the 4th. I want you to understand what that means. It means the Vreth did not rush. It means they looked at Earth, decided it was ready to take, and then continued preparing for 4 more decades because they are not the kind of species that makes mistakes. Their military history, which we reconstructed from signal intercepts over 60 years, contained 0 failed campaigns. Every civilization they had ever moved against had been absorbed into their empire within weeks of first contact. Their doctrine was simple and absolute: study, prepare, overwhelm, occupy. They had never needed a second attempt at anything. This is why they were not afraid of us. This is the thing I could never get certain colleagues to understand in the early years. The Vreth were not arrogant in the way that arrogant people are arrogant, puffed up and careless. They were arrogant the way a very experienced surgeon is arrogant when performing a procedure they have performed 10,000 times. It was not emotion, it was conclusion. They had looked at the data said we were manageable, they believed the data. What they did not know, what they could not have known from the outside, was that we had been reading their mail for 60 years. Dr. Lowe told me this on my 3rd day. She sat me down in her office, which had no windows because the Bureau's upper floors were in a basement, and she explained the shape of the thing I had walked into. The Bureau's public function was contact and communication. Its private function, the one that very few people knew about even within the government, was something else entirely. We called it the mirror. We were not just decoding their signals. We were learning everything they planned to do, and we were planning around it, and we had been planning around it for a very long time. I asked her how long. She smiled. She had a very calm smile, the kind that belongs to people who have been sitting with enormous secrets for so long that the secrets have become comfortable, she said. Long enough. I spent the next 11 years reading Vreth transmissions. I learned their language well enough to think in it, which is a strange experience, because Vreth grammar is built around certainty. They do not have a word for might. They do not have a construction for maybe. Every sentence in their language is a statement of what is or what will be. There is no room in their language for doubt, which tells you something profound about how they see the universe, and it tells you something even more profound about the blind spot at the center of all their planning. They could not imagine being wrong, not because they were foolish, because their language did not give them a place to put that possibility. About 18 months before March the 4th, the signal traffic from the Vreth fleet changed. The volume increased. The encryption layers became heavier. And buried inside one transmission, in a section that took me 4 weeks to fully decode, I found the date. I printed it out. I walked to Harriet's office. I put the paper on her desk. She read it, nodded once, picked up her phone, and made a call. I do not know who she called. I know that within 6 hours I had been moved to a secure sub-level of the Bureau that I had not previously known existed, and within 24 hours, I was sitting in a room with people whose names I will not write here, watching a presentation about something called Red Guest. Red Guest was not a new thing. It had been running quietly, like a piece of software in the background of a very large computer, for 31 years. It was the answer to the question that every serious defense planner had been asking, since the Bureau first confirmed the Vreth were coming. What do you do when the enemy has spent a century studying your every move? You spend a century studying theirs, and then you make sure that everything they think they know about you is exactly one step behind what is actually true. I sat in that room and I listened, and the cold thing in my chest that I mentioned at the beginning of this account, the thing I felt when the sky broke open, I felt it for the first time in that sub-level room, 18 months before the invasion. It was not quite fear. It was the feeling of understanding something completely, of seeing all the way to the bottom of a very deep thing. The Vreth had trained for 100 years to take this planet. They had no idea how long we had been training to stop them. On the morning of March the 3rd, one day before the sky cracked open, I stood at my window and watched Geneva go about its morning the way Geneva always does, with a kind of efficient Swiss calm that I have always found comforting. Trams running on schedule. Cafes opening their shutters. A man walking a dog along the lakeshore. The dog investigating something in the grass with the absolute commitment that only dogs bring to that activity. Thought about the Vreth word for harvest. I thought about Dr. George Halliwell writing in pencil in a margin 76 years ago. I thought about Harriet's smile. Then I finished my coffee, went back to my desk and began checking my work one final time. Not because I thought I had made mistakes. Because I am very thorough, and because the next 36 hours were going to require everything to be exactly right. I was not afraid. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the story to include more fear than it does. What I felt was closer to the feeling you get at the very top of a tall building, when you look down and your body understands the distance completely and goes very still, not panic, clarity. The Vreth were coming. They had been coming for a century. And for a century, quietly, without ceremony or announcement, humanity had been getting ready. I closed my files. I organized my desk. I set 2 alarms for the following morning. Then I went home and slept better than I had slept in years. The first alarm went off at 5 in the morning. I was already awake. I had been awake since 4, sitting at the small table in my kitchen with a cup of tea I was not really drinking, watching the darkness outside my window, the way you watch something you expect to change. The city was silent in that particular way. Cities are silent before dawn, not empty, just holding its breath. I could see the light above the mountains beginning to shift from black to something almost purple. And I remember thinking it was beautiful, which is a strange thing to think on the morning the world changes. But there it is. I dressed quickly. I had laid my clothes out the night before. I took the bureau car that arrived at my building at 5:20, driven by a man named Craig who had been my driver on early morning bureau business for 4 years and who had the rare quality of understanding when conversation was not required. He did not speak. I did not speak. We drove through the quiet streets toward the bureau building, and I watched the city pass through the window and thought about all the people still asleep in all those apartments, not knowing. At 5:43 I was at my station in the secure sub-level. The room was already full. People I knew and people I did not know sat at screens and spoke in low voices. And the atmosphere was the atmosphere of a place where everyone present understands exactly how serious the situation is, and has made a private decision to remain calm regardless. Harriet was standing near the central display, holding a tablet, reading something with the focused attention she brought to everything. She looked up when I walked in, gave me one brief nod, and went back to reading. That was all I needed. If Harriet was calm, the situation was under control. At 6:03, every screen in the room updated simultaneously. The Vreth fleet had entered the upper atmosphere. 17 vessels. I had known the number for 6 weeks, because we had been tracking the fleet since it crossed the outer edge of our solar system. Using instruments the Vreth did not know we had. Positioned in locations the Vreth had not thought to check, because their surveillance data was detailed, but it was also 90 years old in some sections, and a great deal had changed. The vessels came through 17 separate transit folds, each one positioned directly above a major population center, coordinated to within milliseconds of each other. It was, from a purely technical standpoint, an extraordinary piece of military choreography. I said as much to the person sitting next to me, a signals analyst named Owen who had been awake for 19 hours and looked it. Owen said, "Yeah, they practiced it a lot." He was not wrong. We had watched them practice it. 17 times over the previous 4 years, the Vreth fleet had run simulations of this exact opening sequence in a star system 3 light-years from Earth. We had watched every simulation. We had taken notes. Above Geneva, the vessel was large enough to block the sun. I know this because I watched it on the external feed on the screen in front of me, and because at 6:04, the light coming through the ventilation grate near the ceiling of our sublevel room changed quality in a way that was not subtle. It went from the pale early light of a March morning to something darker and more even, the kind of light you get on a heavily overcast day, except there had been no clouds forecast. At 6:05, the Vreth began broadcasting their surrender demand. I had written the translation myself. I will not reproduce all of it here, but I will tell you it was formal, structured, and thorough in the way that everything the Vreth produced was thorough. It addressed the governments of Earth by name, acknowledged that humanity had achieved a level of development worthy of integration into the Vreth Empire, outlined the terms of surrender in precise detail, and gave a response window of 45 minutes. It was broadcast on every available radio frequency, on optical channels, and through a mechanism that induced it directly into certain electronic communication networks, in a way that bypassed conventional signal reception entirely. It was very professional. It had been playing for 11 seconds when Red Guest activated. I need to tell you about Red Guest properly, because most of what has been reported about it is incomplete. The public version of the story describes Red Guest as an automated defense system, which is technically accurate but deeply insufficient. Calling Red Guest a defense system is like calling a chess grandmaster a person who moves pieces on a board. Both statements are true. Neither one tells you anything useful. Red Guest was not built to defend Earth. It was built to end the conversation before the other party realized a conversation had started. It had 3 layers. The first layer was information. For 31 years, every significant military and intelligence development on Earth had been fed into a planning system that modeled Vreth tactics, with the precision only possible when you have been reading the enemy's own internal documents for 6 decades. Every weapon system, every defense platform, every orbital installation that humanity built or upgraded or quietly repositioned over those 31 years was placed, with Red Guest's models in mind, not in response to what the Vreth knew about us, in response to what we knew about them. The second layer was the orbital grid. The Vreth's intelligence on our satellite and weapons network was, from their perspective, complete. They had cataloged every platform, assessed every capability, and determined that the combined orbital defensive capacity of Earth was significant, but manageable for a fleet of 17 dreadnoughts. They were correct about that assessment, as of approximately 30 years ago. In the time since, the grid had been expanded by a factor of 3, not in ways that were visible from outside the solar system, not in ways that produced heat signatures or electromagnetic emissions that a watching fleet would detect as military construction. The expansion was quiet, patient, and comprehensive. When Harriet had told me on my 3rd day at the Bureau that they had been planning for long enough, this was part of what she meant. The 3rd layer was the part I found most remarkable, and I say that as someone who finds the orbital grid already remarkable. The 3rd layer was us, the people, not the weapons or the platforms or the automated systems, but the individual human beings who had spent their careers doing one specific thing in preparation for this specific morning. Captain Nina Dawson of the Coastal Defense Installation in the Canary Islands had spent 14 years developing a method for tracking transit fold exit vectors in real time, using an array of instruments most people considered obsolete. She had been considered eccentric for most of those 14 years. On the morning of March the 4th, her method was the only reason we knew within seconds exactly where each of the 17 dreadnoughts had positioned itself. Commander Elliot Park, stationed aboard a deep space monitoring vessel at the outer edge of the asteroid belt, had quietly repositioned his ship 4 days before the invasion in a way that violated his standing orders, based entirely on his personal read of Vreth fleet movement patterns. He had filed a report explaining his reasoning. The report had been approved 6 hours after he filed it, which was the fastest any such deviation from protocol had ever been approved in the Bureau's history, because the person who read it recognized immediately that he was right. Lieutenant Francis Cole had been assigned to a Bureau team focused on modeling Vreth ground assault patterns, a role that most of her colleagues considered secondary because everyone assumed the orbital battle would be decisive. Francis had spent 3 years arguing that the Vreth would attempt an atmospheric entry through the North Atlantic corridor, even if the orbital battle was going badly for them, because the corridor matched a specific set of geographic parameters that Vreth doctrine consistently identified as favorable entry conditions. 3 years of arguing. She had produced 47 reports. She had been largely ignored. 68 hours before March the 4th, the interceptor drone array in the North Atlantic was quietly repositioned to cover the corridor Francis had identified. I did not know all of these people on the morning of March the 4th. I came to know them later. But I want to name them here, because the story of what happened is very often told as the story of systems and weapons and automated responses, and that framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Red Guest was built by people who were patient and serious and very, very good at their work. At 6:05 and 40 seconds, the first response to the Vreth surrender demand was broadcast from Earth. It was not a verbal response. It was not a message at all in the linguistic sense. What happened was that a sequence of electromagnetic pulses, precisely calibrated and timed, lit up across the orbital grid in a pattern that the Vreth fire control systems would recognize immediately as targeting locks, all 17 vessels, simultaneously. I was watching the main display when it happened, and I want to try to describe what that looked like. From inside a sublevel room with no windows, the display showed a schematic of Earth's orbital space, with the 17 Vreth vessels marked as red points and our orbital platforms as white ones. In the space of about 2 seconds, every white point on the display developed a line connecting it to one or more red points. The display turned into something that looked like a web, a very bright, very dense web. Owen next to me let out a breath. The Vreth surrender demand was still playing. The beautiful, pre-recorded voice in perfect Mandarin was midway through the section about integration, terms when the first rail platforms rose out of the mountains. I could not see them from the sublevel, but I had the external feed on screen, and I watched the Swiss Alps do something the Swiss Alps do not typically do. Panels that had for 30 years been indistinguishable from the rock face around them folded back, and the platforms they concealed extended upward on hydraulic columns, and the weapons systems mounted on those platforms oriented themselves toward the sky with a mechanical smoothness that comes from having been tested in exactly this configuration several hundred times. There are moments when you understand something intellectually for years, and then one day you see it with your own eyes, and the understanding changes character entirely. I had known about the mountain installations for 2 years. I had read the technical specifications. I had seen the schematic diagrams, but watching those panels open on the external feed, in the gray morning light with the sky above Geneva dark from the shadow of an alien warship, I felt the understanding shift from something I knew in my head to something I knew in my whole body. We had been ready for this. We had been ready for this for a very long time. At 6:07, the orbital grid opened fire. What happened in the next 3 minutes I can only partially describe from the sublevel, because we were working from sensor data and display feeds rather than direct observation. But I will tell you what the data showed, and I will tell you what the people in the room around me said and did, because those things are part of the record too. The Vreth vessels began evasive maneuvers almost immediately. This was expected. Their evasion patterns had been modeled from 6 decades of observed Vreth fleet behavior, and the orbital grid's targeting systems had been configured to account for the 3 most probable evasion sequences for each vessel position. When the dreadnoughts moved, the targeting solutions moved with them. Owen was on a channel with the orbital coordination team, listening through an earpiece, occasionally saying yes or confirmed or copy in a voice that stayed level. He had very good operational composure for someone who had been awake for 19 hours. I would tell him so later. He would say thank you and then fall asleep in his chair. Harriet moved to stand behind me, looking at my screen. She had been moving steadily around the room for the past several minutes, checking in with different stations, gathering information in the way she always gathered information, quietly and completely. She stood behind me for about 45 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Check your translations on the command channel. They are going to start communicating between vessels, and I want to know if they deviate from doctrine." I was already on the command channel. I had been on it since 603. I told her so. She nodded and moved on. The Vreth command channel was extremely busy. I will not pretend I could keep up with it in real time, because the volume and speed of transmission was beyond what any human translator can process simultaneously, but I had a recording buffer running, and I was doing my best to flag the most significant content as it came in. What I was hearing, in the broad sense, was the sound of a fleet responding to a situation that did not match its models. The Vreth commanders were not panicking. I want to be clear about that. These were experienced military leaders of a species with a perfect campaign record, and they were responding to the orbital response with professionalism and speed. They were issuing orders, adjusting positions, coordinating return fire. They were doing everything their doctrine prescribed. The problem was that their doctrine had been written for a version of Earth that no longer existed. At 6:10, the kinetic impactors reached their targets. The impactors were not a new technology. They were simple in principle. Very dense objects accelerated to very high velocities and aimed very precisely. They had been in transit for 6 hours before the invasion began, moving on trajectories that were calculated based on the positions the Vreth vessels would occupy once they completed their transit fold sequence. We had known those positions because we had watched the Vreth practice the sequence 17 times. This is the part of the story that I find most remarkable to think about, even now. The impactors had been launched 6 hours before the first Vreth vessel appeared in our sky. They had been launched based on calculations made from observations of Vreth fleet exercises conducted years earlier. They were not fired in response to the invasion. They were already there, waiting, when the invasion arrived. 3 of the 17 dreadnoughts were struck in the first wave. The strikes did not destroy the vessels, because kinetic impactors are not designed to destroy something as large as a Vreth dreadnought outright. They were designed to damage specific systems, navigation, shields, drive arrays. The targeting had been precise. On the command channel, I heard the Vreth fleet commander's voice change. Not much. A small change. A slight compression in the cadence of his speech. The way a person's voice changes when they encounter a problem they were not expecting. In Vreth, there is no word for surprise. There is a word for data that does not match the model, and I heard him use it. At 6:12, the Vreth attempted to reposition 3 vessels to cover the gaps created by the impactor strikes. The repositioning sequence was one of their 3 primary tactical responses to unexpected orbital resistance. We had modeled all 3. The orbital grid's next targeting solution had already accounted for it. In the sublevel room, the display was showing things I could not process emotionally in real time. I was processing them professionally, which is a different kind of processing, more narrow and more precise. There would be time for the other kind later. Right now I had a job. At 6:14, the atmospheric entry attempt began. I want to tell you about Frances Cole now because this is her moment. Frances was not in the sublevel with me. She was at a coastal monitoring station on the western side of Ireland, in a small building that looked, from the outside, like a telecommunications relay facility, which it was, among other things. She had been at that station for 8 months, following an assignment that she had specifically requested, that had taken 6 months of formal and informal lobbying to obtain, and that most of her supervisors had considered an eccentric use of her considerable abilities. When the Vreth vessels in the Northern Hemisphere began moving to identify atmospheric entry windows, 3 of them oriented toward the North Atlantic Corridor. Frances had a direct line to the Interceptor Drone Coordination Center. She had arranged for that line to exist 2 years earlier. During a conversation with a logistics officer named Henry Bright, who had looked at her reasoning, asked 2 very good questions, and then made it happen. Frances activated the drone array at 6:14 and 30 seconds. The Vreth entry vehicles that came through the corridor at 6:15 encountered a drone field that their intelligence said did not exist. Their intelligence was correct. As of approximately 72 hours earlier, it had not been updated since. In the sublevel, Owen said, "North corridor is closed." On the command channel, I heard the Vreth fleet commander use the phrase, "Data does not match the model" again. This time, the compression in his voice was more pronounced. At 16, a Vreth commander I had not previously heard on the channel began transmitting directly to Fleetmaster Orun, the overall commander of the invasion force, whose voice I knew extremely well from years of monitoring Vreth military communications. I had transcribed over 400 hours of Orun's transmissions. I knew his cadence, his preferred phrasing, his habits of emphasis. I could read him the way you can read a person you have known for years, which in a sense was true, though he did not know I existed. The commander speaking to Orun was recommending a withdrawal and regroup. It was a sensible recommendation given the situation. Orun rejected it. This was also consistent with his profile. Orun did not retreat. In 40 years of Vreth military campaigns, Orun had never ordered a retreat. His record was the reason he had been given command of what the Vreth considered their most significant campaign in 3 centuries. He was, by any measure, the finest military mind the Vreth had produced in living memory. He was also, at this particular moment, in possession of a tactical picture that was approximately 90 years out of date. At 6:17 and 40 seconds, Fleetmaster Orun made a decision that was, within the framework of Vreth military doctrine, entirely correct. He ordered a microfold, a short-range transit maneuver designed to remove his command vessel from the current engagement zone and reposition it at a distance sufficient to reassess and redeploy. The Vreth did not use microfolds often. They were fuel expensive and required a very precise calculation window. But they were nearly impossible to counter because the exit vector was determined at the moment of fold initiation and was functionally unpredictable to any targeting system that did not have direct access to the fold calculation, nearly impossible. The vessel that fired the shot that ended the battle was not one of the large orbital platforms. It was a destroyer-class ship designated the Ines Tenacity, positioned at the time in a medium-altitude orbit, captained by a woman named Lieutenant Commander Alice Marsh. Alice Marsh had spent most of her career doing something her supervisors found unconventional. When running tactical exercises, she had a habit of pausing at critical moments and asking her crew, "If we were the other side and we were losing, what would we do right now?" She had done this in hundreds of exercises over 15 years. She documented the answers. She kept records. She had a collection of notebooks, actual physical notebooks with actual handwriting, that cataloged the thinking of dozens of officers across many different simulated scenarios, all focused on the same question: what does a losing commander do when doctrine is no longer working? She had been thinking about Orun specifically for 8 months, ever since she was assigned to the Tenacity's orbital position as part of Red Guest's final deployment phase. She had read everything the Bureau had collected on him. She had studied his 40-year record. She had sat with the question of what he would do when his models failed. At 6:17 and 20 seconds, 20 seconds before Orun initiated the microfold, Alice Marsh told her weapons officer to calculate a firing solution for a fold exit vector at bearing 27 Mark 11, adjusted for standard Vreth emergency repositioning geometry. Her weapons officer, a young man named Dan Keller, who had served under Alice for 2 years, and who had learned to trust her instincts with a completeness that surprised, even him, did not ask why. He calculated the solution at 6:17 and 42 seconds. Orun's command vessel initiated the microfold. At 6:17 and 43 seconds, Alice Marsh said fire. At 6:17 and 51 seconds, the fold completed. The Vreth command vessel arrived at the exit vector at 6:17 and 52 seconds. In the sub-level room in Geneva, I was watching the feed when the command channel went silent, not gradually, all at once. One moment Orun's voice and the voices of his fleet were filling my earpiece with the compressed, precise language of a military force still fighting, still calculating, still refusing to accept what the data was showing them. And then there was silence. Owen looked at his screen, then he looked at me. At 6:18 and 14 seconds, the display showed the last red point in Earth's orbital space go dark. No Vreth vessel above Earth remained operational. The battle had lasted exactly 10 minutes and 14 seconds from the first activation of the orbital grid. I took my earpiece out. I set it on the desk very carefully, as though setting it down carefully mattered now. I looked at the display for a long moment. Harriet was standing in the center of the room. She had her tablet in her hand. She was looking at the same display I was looking at. After a moment, she said, in the calm and measured voice she brought to everything, "Verify all sectors. I want confirmation from every grid node before anyone stands down." People began confirming sectors. I started transcribing Orun's last 6 minutes of transmissions from the recording buffer, because that was my job and because having a job to do was at that moment a useful thing. Outside, somewhere above us, the sky over Geneva was beginning to let the sunrise back in. 3 weeks after the battle, I was part of a team that boarded what remained of a Vreth command frigate. It was not the flagship. The flagship was gone. I am speaking of a smaller vessel, a command and coordination ship that had been positioned at the edge of the engagement zone and had taken significant damage to its drive and weapons systems early in the battle, leaving it functionally intact, but incapable of either fighting or fleeing. We had kept it that way deliberately, from the moment our targeting systems identified it as a potential intelligence source. The crew had surrendered at 6:22 on the morning of March the 4th, 8 minutes after the last dreadnought went dark, using a distress signal format that we recognized from decades of monitored Vreth communications. It had taken 3 weeks to clear the ship for boarding, not because of any danger from the crew, who were cooperative in the careful, formal way of people who understand their situation completely, but because the biological protocols required time. The Vreth and humanity had never shared physical space before. There were things to be certain about. I will not describe the interior of the vessel in detail here, because that description exists in the official Bureau report, and this account is not that document. I will tell you that it was cold, because the Vreth operate in temperatures significantly below what humans find comfortable, and that the lighting was a spectrum I found slightly disorienting, a warm orange that made everything look as though it were photographed at sunset. I will tell you that it smelled like salt, and something else I could not identify, and that the sound of my own footsteps in the corridors felt too loud, the way footsteps feel in a library. I will tell you that the data cores were in the command section, behind a sealed door that required a code we had obtained from the surrendered crew. Through 3 days of extremely patient conversation, conducted largely through a translation interface I had built over the previous year from my work on the Vreth language, the crew did not give us the code willingly. They gave it because the conversation eventually reached a point where one of the senior officers, a tall, pale-plated individual whose rank I estimated from the insignia as equivalent to a colonel, looked at me across the table and said something that I translated as, "You already know what is in there." It was not a question. It was the Vreth equivalent of a statement of fact. I said, "Yes, but we want to understand it completely." He was quiet for a moment. Then he gave us the code. The data cores contained what I expected them to contain, the invasion plan. The complete invasion plan in its final form, with all its appendices and supplementary documents, and the attached historical record of the century of preparation that had preceded it. I spent 4 days reading it. I brought food to the desk they had set up for me in the secure analysis room, and I read, and I made notes. And I found myself in the strange position of being genuinely impressed by something that had been designed to end everything I cared about. It was, without question, the most comprehensive military planning document I had ever encountered. It ran to the equivalent of several 100,000 pages in translation, covering every aspect of the invasion from initial positioning through long-term occupation. Every major city on Earth had been individually assessed. Every known military installation had a specific response protocol attached to it. There were contingency branches for 63 different ways the initial engagement might deviate from the primary scenario, with detailed response plans for each deviation. 63 contingency branches, we had checked. Red Guest had accounted for all 63. There was a section that I found particularly striking. It was the psychological assessment of humanity, the Vreth's formal analysis of how humans would respond to the invasion at an individual and collective level. It was thorough. It addressed fear responses, cooperation under threat, the role of leadership in crisis, the likelihood of organized resistance versus submission at various stages of the occupation process. It was in many respects accurate. The Vreth understood human psychology at the level of behavior quite well. A century of watching had given them a detailed picture of what people do under pressure. What they did not understand was why. The assessment addressed human fear extensively. It correctly identified that humans respond to overwhelming force with a combination of paralysis and desperation that the Vreth had learned to exploit in every previous campaign they had conducted. It predicted that the initial response to the fleet's arrival would be panic, followed by fragmented resistance, followed by organized but ultimately futile opposition, followed by negotiated surrender. What it did not account for, what its psychological models had no mechanism to account for, was the specific kind of fear that produces not paralysis but preparation. The fear that a person or a species feels when they know something is coming, and they have time to get ready. That particular transformation, from anxiety to readiness, from dread to discipline, was not in the Vreth's models. Their previous campaigns had not given them a subject that had 60 years of warning. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about it in the context of the Vreth language, which has no word for doubt and no grammatical space for uncertainty. A species whose language is built around certainty would naturally model the behavior of other species in terms of their responses to certain things. Certain attack, certain defeat, certain overwhelming force. They had modeled everything that was certain. They had not modeled the one thing that was not, that the target had known they were coming, and had been quietly, systematically, patiently transforming their fear into a defense so thorough that the certain things became uncertain. On the fourth day, I reached the final section of the invasion plan. It contained Orun's personal command notes, appended to the official document in the Vreth equivalent of a handwritten addendum. These were his private observations, not meant for the plan itself but attached to his copy of it in a way that suggested he kept them there for his own reference. Most of them were tactical. Notes about positioning, about timing, about the specific capabilities of vessels under his command. Standard command thinking, the internal monologue of a very experienced officer reviewing his own plan. Near the end of his notes, I found something different. It was a short passage, and I will translate it as accurately as I can here. He wrote, "The target species is capable. This is documented. They fight with determination, and they adapt to tactical situations with reasonable speed. The primary advantage we hold is not superiority of force, though we have it. The primary advantage is that they do not know how to fight us. We know how to fight them. This asymmetry of knowledge is decisive. It has been decisive in every campaign I have commanded. The side that knows the other well, while remaining unknown itself, controls the engagement from the beginning." I sat with that passage for a long time. Then I went to find Harriet. She was in the corridor outside the analysis room, reading something on her tablet, because Harriet is always in a corridor, reading something on her tablet. I handed her my printed translation of Orun's note. She read it, she nodded, she handed it back. I said, "He identified exactly the principle that defeated him." She looked at me in the way she sometimes looks at people when they have said something, accurate that she has already known for a long time. Then she said, "He was very good." I said, "Yes." She said, "So were we." There was a long silence in the corridor, which was quiet and orange-lit and cold. Then I asked the question I had been working up to for 3 days. I asked her when they had decided. Not when Red Guest was built, because I knew that. I asked when the decision had been made that humanity would not simply defend itself, but would prepare to do so with such completeness that the invasion would end before the Vreth understood what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you remember I told you on your first day that they had been watching us since 1947? I said yes. She said, "We started planning in 1948. I thought about Dr. George Hallowell's pencil note in the margin of a decryption document. I think they are counting us, and the people who read that note, and thought about what came next, and the 76 years of quiet, serious, patient work that followed. The Vreth had the benefit of certainty. They knew what they were going to do, and they knew how they were going to do it, and they had absolutely no doubt that it would work, because it had always worked, because they were very good, because their models were thorough, and their preparation was genuine, and their military history was spotless. What they did not have was doubt. And without doubt, you cannot ask the most important question, which is, what if I am wrong? We had doubt in abundance. We had been afraid for 76 years. We had lain awake in the night and run the scenarios and asked the what-ifs and looked at the gaps in our knowledge and worked to fill them. Not because we were certain we could, but because we were afraid of what would happen if we could not. And that fear, sustained and redirected over 3 generations, had built something the Vreth certainty never could. A defense designed not for the enemy they thought they were fighting, but for the enemy we actually were. The recovered crew of the frigate were processed according to a protocol that took many months. The diplomatic dimensions of the aftermath were complex in ways that filled many more documents than I intend to write here. What I will say is that the conversations that followed, first with the surviving Vreth crew, and later with the broader Vreth civilization, which became possible through channels that opened slowly and carefully over the following months, were among the most important conversations in human history. I was in many of them. That is part of the reason I am the one writing this account. Orun's last logged transmission, recorded in the final 38 seconds before Alice Marsh's shot found him, was a message addressed to his second-in-command. It was personal in a way that I had not seen in his communications before. Less formal, less structured, the breath equivalent of a man speaking without his armor on. He did not curse us. He did not express bitterness or disbelief in the way I might have expected from someone in his position. What he said, translated as accurately as I can manage while preserving the sentence, was this: we never asked them what they feared. We watched what they did. We catalogued their actions and their weapons, and their responses to the things we showed them. We built our picture of them from the outside. I believe now that we did not know them at all. A people that can be afraid for 100 years and keep working anyway is not a people that any model I have ever used can fully account for. We were thorough. We were not curious enough. He sent the message. 17 seconds later, the fold completed, and 5 seconds after that, Alice Marsh was right. I have read that transmission many times. I have translated it, retranslated it, questioned my own word choices at every step, tried to make sure that what I am rendering in English is genuinely what he said and not what I want him to have said. I believe the translation is correct. What strikes me most is not the admission in it, though the admission is significant. What strikes me most is the observation about fear. He recognized in those final seconds that he had misread us at the most fundamental level. He had seen our fear as a weakness to be exploited. He had not understood that we had spent a century turning it into something else entirely. I went back to Geneva 2 months after the boarding. The city looked the same. The trams were running on schedule. The cafes had their shutters open. I walked along the lake in the early morning and watched a man walk his dog on the shore. The dog investigating something in the grass with great concentration. And I thought about continuity. About the way life continues in its ordinary patterns even when enormous things are happening around it, and because of it. I thought about all the people who had worked inside Red Guest over 31 years, most of whom no one would ever name, who had done their part of a very large thing without knowing the full shape of it. The engineers who designed orbital platforms to specifications they were told were simply upgraded safety protocols. The analysts who filed reports that fed into planning processes they were not cleared to fully understand. The logistics officers like Henry Bright, who received a request from a xenolinguist analyst about a direct communication line to an interceptor drone stationed in Ireland and asked 2 good questions and then made it happen. And I thought about Francis Cole, who had spent 3 years writing 47 reports about an entry corridor that no one wanted to think about, and who had kept writing them anyway, because she was afraid of what would happen if she did not. That is the thing about working from fear. Fear is not comfortable, and it is not inspiring in the way that confidence is inspiring, but it is remarkably motivating, and it is honest. Fear does not allow you to stop asking what if. It does not allow you to build a model and declare it complete. It makes you keep checking, keep adjusting, keep asking, what have I missed? What do I not know yet? What will I wish I had done differently? The Vreth did not have that kind of relationship with uncertainty. Their language would not allow it, and so for all their intelligence and their thoroughness and their genuine skill, they arrived at Earth with a picture of us that was detailed in every way except the most important one. They did not know who we were underneath the data. We knew who they were. We had read their letters. We had watched their drills. We had listened to Orun think out loud for 40 years. And we had taken everything we learned, and we had built something that they could not see, coming because they did not believe we were the kind of species that would think to do it. 9 months after the battle, I stood in a hall in Vienna and spoke to the first formal gathering of spacefaring civilizations. There were 9 species represented in that room. 2 of them I had never heard of before the invitations were sent, because their observation of Earth had apparently been even quieter than the Vreth's, which was a thought I chose to set aside until after the speech. The others I knew from bureau files with varying degrees of familiarity. They had all, in their different ways, been watching what happened on March the 4th with close attention. The interstellar assembly was not our idea. It was proposed by a civilization called the Thekan, who sent a diplomatic signal through a frequency we had not previously identified as used for deliberate communication, 2 weeks after the battle, requesting contact through formal channels. Within a month, 6 other signals had arrived from 6 other directions. Within 2 months, the logistics of organizing a physical meeting, the first in the history of multiple spacefaring species, had become the most complicated diplomatic challenge anyone on Earth had ever faced. I was appointed as humanity's primary representative for the linguistic and communication aspects of the assembly, which in practice meant I was the primary representative for everything, because communication is everything in a room full of species who have never spoken before. I had 3 weeks to prepare my address. I wrote it 9 times. 8 of those versions were different versions of the same speech, a careful, measured account of what humanity had done and why, structured to present us in the most favorable possible light. The 9th version was the one I actually gave. I stood in front of beings whose physiologies ranged from the familiar to the entirely unlike anything I could have imagined before I started this work, and I said this: we are a species that has been afraid for a very long time. I do not tell you this as an apology or an explanation. I tell you this as the most accurate description of ourselves that I can offer. We have been afraid of the dark, afraid of the unknown, afraid of the things we could not see that might be looking at us. We have been afraid of each other, in ways that have cost us enormously, and we have been afraid of what lay beyond our atmosphere, in ways that cost us very little, because we transformed that fear into work. I want to be honest with you about what happened 3/4 of a year ago, because I believe honesty is the only foundation for what we are trying to build in this room. A fleet came to take our world. We had known it was coming for a very long time. We were afraid of it for all of that time, and we used that fear the way you use any tool that has no other application, carefully and to the fullest extent possible. We are not here because we are stronger than the Vreth. We are not here because we are smarter, or more numerous or more advanced. We are here because we had something they did not. The particular kind of humility that comes from not being able to imagine your own certainty. They were certain, we were afraid, and fear, in the right hands over enough time, can build things that certainty never dreams are necessary. I paused there. The room was very quiet. 9 different species, plus the human contingent, watching me with 9 different kinds of attention that I could not fully read but that felt, in aggregate, like being looked at very carefully. I said, we would like to know you, not to count you or catalog you or assess your capacity. We would like to know what you are afraid of, and what you have built because of it, and what you hope for, and what you are still working on. We have been alone with our questions for a long time. We would prefer not to be alone with them anymore. I sat down. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to become briefly convinced that I had misjudged the tone entirely. And then the Thecan representative, a being I knew from 3 weeks of preparatory communication to have an extremely precise and formal communication style, said something in their own language that their translation system rendered as, "That is an unusual approach for a species that just demonstrated decisive military superiority," I said. "We are not a species that feels comfortable with superiority. It makes us nervous. We tend to worry about what we have missed." The Thecan representative was quiet for a moment. Then they said, "That is perhaps the most reassuring thing we have heard about you." There were many more conversations after that one. The assembly lasted 11 days and covered topics that I could fill several more documents describing, and I will not attempt to cover them here. What I will say is that the picture that emerged of the broader situation in our region of the galaxy was not what any of us had expected, and was in some ways more interesting and in some ways more sobering than the picture we had carried into that room. Several of the civilizations present had been watching Earth specifically because of the Vreth. They had been aware of the Vreth's intention and had been curious, in the careful way of species who have seen this story before, about how it would end. 2 of them had been subjects of Vreth campaigns themselves in earlier centuries, and had been absorbed and had later regained independence through processes too complex to summarize here. They had a relationship with the Vreth that was historical and layered, in ways that changed everything I thought I understood about the geopolitical situation we had just entered. One of them, a species I will call the Aerith, because their actual name does not translate cleanly into any human phonetic system, had been present the day the Vreth first crossed interstellar space. They had been watching for 400 years. Their perspective on the Vreth was therefore both deep and specific in ways that made every conversation with their representative one of the most educational experiences of my life. The Aerith representative told me, on the 2nd day of the assembly, during a break in formal proceedings, that they had expected the Vreth campaign against Earth to succeed. Not because they thought poorly of humanity, but because every previous campaign the Vreth had conducted had succeeded, and the variables that they knew about did not obviously suggest a different outcome. I asked what variables they had not known about. They said, "You." I asked them to clarify. They said, "The Vreth's campaigns succeed because the target never has enough information in advance to prepare adequately." You had enough information. That is the variable we did not have access to. We did not know how much you knew. We assumed, as we think most observers assumed, that you knew somewhat more than the Vreth expected, but somewhat less than was necessary. We were wrong about the second part, I said. We were very thorough. The Aerith representative made a gesture that their translation system flagged as indicating something between appreciation and a kind of rueful acknowledgement. They said, yes, we understand that now. I thought about Harriet in the corridor, telling me they had started planning in 1948. I thought about 3 generations of people who had worked inside Red Guest without knowing its full shape. I thought about Frances Cole writing her 47th report. I thought about Alice Marsh keeping notebooks about losing commanders. I said, we had a lot of help, not from outside, from ourselves, from people who were afraid and kept working anyway. The Aerith representative was quiet for a moment. Then they said, that is in our experience the rarest thing. The assembly ended on the 11th day with a set of agreements that I am not at liberty to describe in detail here. What I will tell you is that humanity left Vienna with something that none of us had walked in expecting to leave with. Not recognition, not respect in the formal sense, though we had both. What we left with was membership, a place at a table that had existed for a very long time without us, and that had changed its configuration permanently because of what happened on a March morning over a planet that the rest of the galaxy had been watching with a certain degree of held breath. We were not celebrated. I want to be accurate about that. The mood in the room was not triumphant. It was something more complicated. The mood of people who have been watching a very tense situations resolve in an unexpected direction and are still processing what it means for the map they have been using. That seemed right to me. Celebration would have been the wrong note. What had happened was not something to celebrate in the way you celebrate an achievement. It was something to understand, carefully and completely, and then to carry forward without letting the weight of it distort your next steps. On the last evening, after the formal proceedings were concluded, and the remaining conversations were the informal, corridor and corner variety that often carry more genuine content than the official ones, I stepped outside the assembly building for a few minutes alone. It was late autumn in Vienna. The air was cold and clean. The streets around the building were quiet. I thought about the man walking his dog on the shore of the lake in Geneva, the morning after the battle, the continuity of ordinary things, the way the world had changed and continued at the same time. I thought about Oron. We never asked them what they feared. We only watched what they did. I had spent a great deal of time with that observation. I had turned it over in many different ways, looking at it from multiple angles, trying to understand exactly what it told me about the Vreth and about us, and about the nature of the gap between those two things. What I kept coming back to was this. The Vreth had built their entire campaign on the assumption that what you do is what you are, that behavior is identity, that if you watch something long enough and carefully enough, you will know it. And in one sense they were right. Behavior does reveal a great deal. A century of surveillance had given them an accurate picture of almost everything they were looking at. What it had not given them was access to the space between the behavior and the person doing it, the interior space where the doing comes from, where the fear lives, and the hope, and the calculation, and the stubborn refusal to accept a conclusion that someone else has drawn about you. We had that space. We had used it. And from the inside of it, we had built something that could not be detected from the outside, because it existed entirely in the realm of intention and preparation, which look from the outside exactly like everything else until the moment they do not. I stood in the cold Vienna air and thought about all of this, and then I went back inside, because there were more conversations to have and more work to do, and I am, at my core, someone who finds that fact more comforting than anything else. The galaxy knew we were here now. That was new. What we did with the knowing was the next question, and it was ours to answer, and it was going to take time. We were used to taking time. I went back inside and found Harriet standing in the corridor, reading something on her tablet. I stopped beside her. She glanced up, gave me the small, calm smile. I said, "What are you reading?" She turned the tablet so I could see. It was a new signal analysis. Preliminary findings only, from a direction I did not immediately recognize. I looked at it for a moment. I said, "Is that what I think it is?" She said, "Probably." I said, "How long have we been picking it up?" She said, "About 3 years." I nodded. I looked at the analysis for another moment. Then I said, "Should I start learning the language?" Harriet looked at me. Then she said, "You already are, aren't you?" I was. I had started 8 months ago, the first time I saw a preliminary signal analysis from that direction, and had a feeling I had learned to take seriously. I said yes. She nodded and went back to reading her tablet. I walked down the corridor to the room where my work was waiting, and I sat down and I opened my files and I kept going. Because that is what you do, you keep going. You take the fear, and you give it something useful to do, and you keep going, and you trust that the work will be there when you need it. It always has been.